Okay, I'm going to start since we are a couple minutes past 12:30, and I'm sure people will be trickling in as we start the event, but there's a lot that we have to get through today, and I'm really excited for everyone that's here because I think this event is going to be really special. So I just wanted to say hello, welcome everyone to our first virtual cultural humility and empathy training at Level. And our mission at Level, if you know about us or if you've tuned into some of our events in the past, is we are a justice and empathy building organization. And we want to disrupt prejudice, build empathy, and advance human rights. And the way in which we do that is through conversations like this, through events where we can talk about difficult things, we can share our stories, we can listen to people from around Canada and hear what they have to say. So Level's cultural humility and empathy training sessions highlight stories and the lived realities of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And they encourage attendees to approach work with Indigenous communities from a place of allyship. Sessions are led by Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers and leaders from various backgrounds, including lawyers, social workers, teachers, and police officers, who share tips and best practices for working with Indigenous communities and youth. Our training sessions provide attendees with insights and challenges to shift from a passive form of reconciliation to a more active one. So we're going to start with a land acknowledgement and opening prayer, and then some traditional knowledge sharing with a knowledge keeper, Kim Wheatley, and then with Métis Senator Constance Simmons. So I just want to give a brief introduction of Kim, who is going to be opening our session today. Kim is Anishinaabe and Ojibwe grandmother from Shawanaga First Nation Reserve, who carries the spirit name, head or leader of the Fire Flower, and who is Turtle Clan. She has appeared on TV, radio, and in many news articles connected to her passion for Indigenous knowledge sharing. She has worked with over 34 First Nations communities, having organized many Indigenous events, and she has authored 4 books and has received multiple awards. She also volunteers on a variety of boards as an Indigenous advisor. And we've had Kim in some of the other capacities that we've worked with Level, and we're so honored to have her here today. This is just a brief agenda of how we're going to go through everything today, and we'll start off with Kim. So thank you, Kim.
Anin bonjour, sego tanse kwe everybody. What a really kind introduction there, Shalane. And I have started the smudge. I am cyber smudging each and every one of you. So if you've never experienced this before, or you're wondering if and how I could do this across technology, Spirit has no bounds, no restrictions. And so in a good way, with a good heart and a good mind, I have been respectfully asked to open us in a good way today. And so I was given this tobacco, which is our Anishinaabe custom. It is the request to speak in a good way. Anin bojo mishike dodam, shkudenigan or waskonen indigenous Shwanagan Dunji, Newmarket and Dunjiba, Anishinaabe, Quail, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Dao. Now, for those of you who aren't language speakers, I essentially said my spirit recognizes your spirit. I am Turtle Clan. I do indeed come from Shawanaga First Nations, and my spirit name is head or leader of the Fire Flower. Shkoden Nigan Wawaskonen. But in English, many people refer to me as Grandmother Kim or Knowledge Keeper Kim or just Kim, and all of those work as well. I am a life giver in this life walk, and I am a mother of 3 daughters and a grandmother of 3 grandchildren with 2 on the way. I'm the firstborn daughter of Pico Mekwe, thunder coming in the distance. And I'm also the firstborn daughter of Naniboy Makwa, new bear standing. I'm tuning in today from the traditional and treaty territory the Chippewas of Georgina Island, but I want to acknowledge all First Nations communities and traditional land bases, and indeed our magnificent island, Turtle Island, as a whole, where all of our relatives have resided, continue to reside, and will continue to reside upon and take care of in a good way with a good heart and a good mind. As we bring our hearts and minds together today, and we think about the sands, the soils, the clays, the gravels, the rocks, the stone beings, and the mountains, we're reminded about strength and resilience. And this journey we're going to take to on this day, I give her greetings and thanks. I also want to acknowledge the swimmers, the crawlers, the flyers, the two-leggeds, the four-leggeds, those that live up in the sky world and those that live beneath the earth. These elder brothers and sisters sacrifice on a daily basis for our well being. And so we should be mindful to give thanks for all of the teachings they provide for us, all the guidance they provided for us, and all the nutrition and many other things that they sacrifice their bodies for us. And then we have to think about the grasses, the shrubs, the trees, the bushes, the hardwoods, the softwoods, the berries, the hanging fruits, and all of the medicines. These beautiful beings are, they're connected to the grandmothers and grandfathers, which is the mineral world, in a beautiful, harmonious fashion. And they heal our bodies, they nourish our tummies, they provide beauty for our senses, and they help to protect us from the elements in, our many various forms of dwellings that we have across the world. And so it's said that, our sole responsibility is just to give greetings and thanks to each and every one of them. And so on this day, I invite you to do just that. Those are the first three orders of creation. The fourth order of creation, according to the teachings, the traditional teachings that I follow, talk about the Niniwag Kwewag Gibanojiag. I know, I just lost you because I reverted into my language. But it's important to insert a bit of language so that your ear can become accustomed to not only our cadence, but the messaging that comes through distinctly by spirit in speaking our language. So I'm talking about the men, the women, and the children that have ever been, that are here right now, and that are on their way. When we look at our relationships to the human family, all humans around the world, this is the space and place where each and every one of us has a space of belonging. We are connected in many obvious ways and sometimes in some very not obvious ways. And so on this day, I want to remind you about the seven guiding principles or the seven morals that we use to conduct ourselves to be the best human beings we can be. And some people refer to them as the seven sacred teachings or the seven grandfather teachings or the seven grandmother teachings. However you come to learn this, I encourage you to embrace this wisdom and knowledge and use it as a guiding force in all of the things you do to do the work that you do, to live the life that you live, and to inspire and support the greater good in all of the ways that you are very capable of doing. So, we're talking about humility and bravery. We're talking about honesty and wisdom. We're talking about truth, respect, and love. These seven guiding principles are applicable to all lines of work in all areas of interest or expertise. And I think, if the country today could embrace a little bit of that as a grounding engagement piece, I think we'd all be a lot better off. And as we struggle through this time known as COVID, this flu that is causing pandemonium for many of us, and kind of disassociating or disconnecting us from our normal chosen way of life. I offer prayers for you on this day to have peace of mind, good health, and good long life, knowing that these are choices that you can make physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And if you are struggling with that, to reach out to those who can help support one of those areas or all of those areas as needed. It's a great honor to remind you about our continued respect and relationship to the lands around this place we call Kanata, and to each other. I want to offer a song to connect us as well, and this song will come from the relatives we have out on the East Coast. Our lovely Mi'kmaq brothers and sisters have many songs, and this one is a greeting song. And I just wanted to start us off in a good way with a good heart and a good mind today, and give you that moment to include any of your prayers. we have Senator Constance Simmons coming right after me, who's going to offer a very concerted prayer. But it would be remiss of me not to say the things that I've been taught to say. And so, with the closing of my song, that will be the end of my welcoming and my greeting on this day, with a sincere wish that we move forward together, remembering the words that are starting us off, the words we hope resonate and sit in your heart, because it's heart speak that we always engage with. So we're talking from our hearts to your hearts. And this song is intended in the same fashion, from my heart, all of our hearts to your hearts, to just give you that moment to add in anything I might have forgotten, anything that you think is really important for you on this day. And you can think it, feel it, say it. You're in your cozy little spaces tuning in. So I'm sure you have a little bit of privacy. Don't be shy to speak to the spirit world. It's as real as our physical world. This is the welcoming song. Hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, young you, young you, hey, young you, hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, young you, young you, hey, young you, hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, young you, young you, hey, young you, hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, Guando Day! Hey, young you, young you, hey, young you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Kim. That was beautiful. We're so happy to have you here and to have all these participants joining now. I want to take a moment to introduce our next person who will be starting with an opening prayer, Constance Simmons. Constance Simmons is a Métis woman from northern Saskatchewan Treaty 6 territory. She is Cree and Scottish. She has served as a Métis senator for the Toronto and York Region Métis Council. She has served the Indigenous community for 40 years, specializing in complex addiction and mental health issues in both BC and Ontario. She worked in both forensic outreach and the forensic psychiatric unit. Constance also served as a Métis representative for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry and as an elder for the Indigenous Advisory Council at the Law Society of Ontario. Constance was a consultant with the U of T Faculty of Law Indigenous Studies Unit and a consultant for the Indigenous Unit at Women's College Hospital. She is a mother of two and a grandmother of two. Constance upholds an Indigenous worldview and seeks to serve her community wherever she is asked. Thank you for being here, Constance. Thank you, Constance. That was beautiful. Thank you for being here today. I wanted to ask Kim to say a few words about her thoughts on the justice system. Kim has had a lot of experience working with our organization, and I'd like her to share some thoughts before we go to our next speaker. Is Kim there? You might have lost her. Okay, so in that case, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, who is Frankie Young. Frankie is an assistant professor at Western Law. As a member of the Benoit First Nation on the west coast of Gahomkuk It is her passion to bring to the legacy academy important and critical legal research and teaching areas related to Indigenous economic development and self-government and the legitimacy of Indigenous laws. Thank you for being here, Frankie.
Thank you so much, Shalane. Constance and Kim, thank you for that amazing introduction. And Constance, you definitely brought some peace over me today. As Shalane indicated, I am from Benoit First Nation in a region called Mi'kma'ki, and I'm from the southwest coast of Dahumguk. And Benoit First Nation claims me, and I claim Benoit First Nation. I am speaking to you today from the beautiful traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Lenni Lenape, and the Attawandaron peoples. And I encourage you, as you're listening to this presentation, to really think about the territory that you are joining us from. And as you're thinking about that traditional territory, I encourage you to think about the relationship that we have with one another and reaffirming that relationship that we have. I think that this training today is definitely timely. We just finished the Indigenous law course with our second year law students, and I think some of you are probably on this session. And lots of lessons learned. We don't have any Indigenous students in the 2L class, and so this training was over 150 students with all non-Indigenous members of the class. So lots of insight, lots of things learned. And I will say that we had phenomenal feedback from the students that really engage meaningfully and recognize that it is so critical to understand, first of all, the history and the context of Indigenous peoples in relation to the legal system in Canada, and the implications of going back hundreds of years, the pre-existence of Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous traditions in Canada long before the legal system that you would now understand as the common law system or the civil law system in Quebec. And so it's really important for us to think back and look at the history in the context of where we're at today and what the legal system in Canada actually means for Indigenous peoples. And so for this discussion, I encourage you to really think about how you can contribute to revealing and correcting misinformation related to Indigenous peoples, related to that historical context. And so in my work, this is done by really respecting the critical role that Indigenous law plays in effecting justice for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so I want to frame this discussion in the context of a teaching from my community, which is called Etowoptimuk. And Etowoptimuk means two-eyed seeing. Etowoptimuk, Dr. Albert Marshall, an elder from Eskasoni First Nation, brought this teaching to academia in Cape Breton initially to encourage more Indigenous students to attend the science program, because Western notions of science and Indigenous ways of knowing, there was often a large gap there. And so Elder Marshall really wanted to encourage both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of the community to think about what it actually means to view understandings through two eyes. And so through one eye, we look through a non-Indigenous lens. And so what are those conceptions that we see in everyday, in Canadian society? So in this context, I'm going to be talking about the legal system. Through the other eye, looking through an Indigenous lens. So looking at Indigenous ways of knowing. And so both eyes are meant to work together. And this is very different. So being willing to look at concepts, to look at the law through an Indigenous lens means getting out of often misconceptions of Indigenous laws, Indigenous legal orders, and how Indigenous law contributes to the greater legal system. And so it's about viewing both areas of knowledge through two eyes. And so, and I actually apply this content, this teaching in a lot of different areas. And so how can a non-Indigenous person contribute to justice for Indigenous peoples? Being willing to see through two eyes, being willing to understand that Indigenous ways of knowing are a part of the rich fabric of Canadian society. Indigenous legal orders are a part of the rich legal system that we have in Canada. So we have a multi-juridical legal system. We have the common law system in most provinces and territories. We have the civil law legal tradition in the province of Quebec. And we have Indigenous legal traditions. And Indigenous legal traditions are diverse and rich all across Canada based upon the nation that is subject to the legal tradition. And so the way that I understand certain, so the legal orders and legal traditions within my Mi'kmaq community in Eastern Canada may be very different than Anishinaabe legal tradition in this territory. And so, but it is about respecting and valuing that Indigenous legal orders are a part of the rich fabric of the Canadian legal system. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what are the benefits in really respecting the concept of Etowaktumuk, respecting two-eyed seeing, to embrace Indigenous ways of knowing, and in this context, embracing Indigenous legal orders. And so what are the benefits for you as law students, as legal practitioners, or members of Canadian society that want to understand some of the nuances? And so more broadly, Indigenous law, Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous legal traditions are comprised of the values and the norms and the worldviews and legal traditions that guide Indigenous nations. Because of the historical impact of assimilation and colonialism, Indigenous legal traditions did not they survived within the communities that were subject to them, but they didn't receive the same weight and authority that the common law and the civil law in Canada has. And so that's changing in the sense of revitalizing and bringing awareness to the inequity that has resulted in this regard in terms of the kind of weight, for example, that Supreme Court decisions or other provincial decisions have given to Indigenous legal traditions in solving legal problems that involve Indigenous peoples. And so I want you to think about the significance of recognizing Indigenous legal traditions, and in particular, as a legal practitioner, in understanding what that significance is to you in somebody that is interacting and dealing with the legal system in Canada on a regular basis. Why is that so important? And so Indigenous law, so first of all, Indigenous law is a part of Canada's legally pluralistic order in the broader legal system in Canada. And so if there isn't an understanding of Indigenous law and the critical role that Indigenous law plays in the legal system, then one's legal knowledge or acumen is incomplete. And there's more and more that's happening in law where there needs to be that competency, there needs to be that cultural competency, there needs to be that understanding. And we're seeing decisions coming out. For example, we had a decision here in Ontario, the Beaver and Hill decision, where a Haudenosaunee party asserted Haudenosaunee laws to resolve a private law dispute between two Indigenous peoples. And so these kinds of issues are going to come before the court. And so we need to deal with the how much the weight that should be given to Indigenous legal traditions. We also have the TRC Commission that has implored Canada to really think about Indigenous legal traditions and the role that Indigenous legal traditions play in the legal system in Canada. There's also a report put out a couple of years ago, Principles for Guiding the Crown's Relationship with Indigenous Nations, that talks about how parties must come together and deal with the jurisdictional issues around Indigenous law and other laws in Canada, so provincial law and federal law. So there's lots of discussion going on. There's a lot more training. This course that we just put on here at Western Law is now a mandatory course for second-year law students. So it's the first time that we held the course, and I brought in Anishinaabe experts in Indigenous legal traditions to talk about first of all, their lived experience, but also the impacts of Anishinaabe law in this region for the community members. And so the students really got to hear firsthand, and we did that in respect of the traditional territory that the Western University is situated on. So what else? So what other kinds of benefits? And so understanding Indigenous legal orders and traditions increases your cultural competency more generally. And so because Indigenous groups across Canada have cultural traditions that are extremely rich and extremely diverse, as I indicated earlier, based upon the nation, it's important that legal practitioners across the country understand the richness and the diversity of these legal traditions. Another area that is important for you to think about is the integral role that Canada's legal system played in the assimilation and colonization of Indigenous communities and peoples. So law in Canada means something different to Indigenous peoples and nations than it does to other members of Canadian society, simply because of the role that many, and one example is when certain ceremonies were made illegal under the Indian Act. And so the potlatch ceremony and Sundance's ceremony. So these ceremonies were made illegal. And so a lot of these ceremonies had to go underground. And so if, as a legal practitioner, you don't understand that history and you don't understand how the common law was predominantly this isn't just a was, this is still going on in current day, that the legal system is really used to hold Indigenous peoples down and not as a means of freedom, which Indigenous legal orders represent for nations. So if you don't have that understanding, then you're really not going to understand the inherent biases and limitations of the law as it applies to Indigenous peoples. And so to be culturally sensitive, to be a culturally competent lawyer, you need to understand the impact of assimilation and colonization based upon those laws and the impact that those laws have traditionally had on Indigenous communities. And so that also touches on another benefit for you, and I'm keeping track of the time here, Shalane. So when you possess that necessary cultural, historical, and legal knowledge of Indigenous legal traditions, you can engage in meaningful dialogue with members of Indigenous communities and be an ally for achieving justice and equality for all Canadians. And so that's critical, and that it's really connected to reconciliation, and it's connected to affirming the relationship that we have with one another. You can better represent Indigenous legal issues. You can, it's a means to effect justice. And So understanding the role of Indigenous legal traditions, but also recognizing that as a lawyer, you have an opportunity to represent in the legal system the importance of courts considering Indigenous legal traditions in rendering decisions is a really important way to be an advocate for Indigenous nations. And I see the time here, so I'm going to just tie it together. Um, I think you also want to be able to comprehend the limitations of applying Indigenous legal concepts in a common law framework. And so there's a lot of discussion in Canada about, how do we go about giving Indigenous legal orders the weight and effect that they deserve, and that historically, obviously, those nations, by the way, the common law, the courts in Canada do not need to affirm Indigenous legal orders for them to be recognized and valid within the communities that are subject to them. And because those laws and those traditions guide the nations in terms of their relationship with each other, and certainly in dispute resolution within communities. And so being able to understand those limitations, being able to understand the limitations of trying to fit Indigenous legal traditions into a common law construct, common law framework, is incredibly challenging. And so non-Indigenous allies can really represent that to Canada's legal system, to courts, to judges, to my dog is getting a little restless here, which means my time must be up. And so so that's another way to really understand how those limitations impact and how those limitations impact Indigenous nations, because it's talking different languages, two different languages in terms of the common law and Indigenous legal traditions. And lastly, and so the calls to action outline the need to include Indigenous law and history in legal curriculum. And notes that there are many ways in which lawyers and other stakeholders can support to what I was just talking about as an ally, how you can play a key role in enabling legal reform. I will say it's wonderful the role that some of the students have taken. So I actually, and on that note, in this regard, that really want to see this is a new generation of lawyers. So this is the next generation of legal leaders in our country. And so many of these students that we just put on the Indigenous law course with were engaged and really grateful to understand this history and to be introduced to the diversity of Indigenous legal orders in Canada. And so I want to point you, so some of the points that I have raised today that I teach to my students, there will be, so one of my students, Sarah Lawson, she has an article coming out in Head Notes at Windsor Law. So I want to give her credit for putting together a document. She's a non-Indigenous student and she put together a document educating parties on the reasons why it is so important to understand, to be taught Indigenous law in law schools, and for lawyers to be culturally competent in understanding Indigenous legal orders. So that ties in with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action in terms of recognizing that lawyers and other stakeholders can also support Indigenous initiatives that enable a reform in this regard. And I see my time is up. So Wilalio, appreciate your time and definitely appreciate Level for taking on this very important initiative.
Thank you, Frankie. I want to open the forum up to some questions that we only have until about 1:20, but if people put some questions in the chat, Caitlin, who's also at our organization, is going to send me those questions, and we can engage in a brief Q&A with Frankie, Constance, and Kim. So if people have any questions, feel free, put those in the chat, and then time permitting, we'll have a chance to talk about some of them. Okay. You see, we have some good questions here. I'm just going to go ahead and pick one. Okay, great. So, where and how can lawyers learn more about the Indigenous legal orders from their territory? So, I'll open that up to Frankie, Constance, and Kim. Frankie, this is probably a question you have some knowledge about. So, you'll just need to unmute.
Yes, I was wondering, I thought I saw raising to say something, Kim? No. Okay. Go.
No, go ahead.
So that's a very good question. So I am and it's important to be culturally sensitive because I'm a Mi'kmaq woman from, as I said, southwest coast of Dahunguk. I have lived experience of Mi'kmaq legal traditions in terms of growing up in the territory. I live and I'm a respectful Mi'kmaq visitor to Anishinaabe territory. So, but I could never profess to understand or be from a lived experience. I can't teach Anishinaabe legal traditions. So we brought in members of the community. It's important for us to respect the traditional territory that we're in. So we brought in members of the community to work with the students and talk to them about the legal traditions. So in terms of understanding what those legal orders are, first of all, there are some things that are not for public consumption. And so it's important to be culturally sensitive to the nations and how much knowledge and how much information they are willing to share. And then it's also, so it's learning from the nation, right? It's being sensitive to the community, it's learning from the nation. And so some nations are, they do have a lot more education awareness because nations are also even teaching their own members that are revitalizing traditions and customs in their own territory for either members that, may have grown up out of the community or even within the community. So you do raise a very good question. It depends on what territory you're living in, and there's information that like these kinds of sessions are valuable. And so I'm not quite sure if Constance or Kim has any recommendations in this particular territory if people wanted to learn, or I guess Constance territory is out west, if there are resources.
So I think your advice, Frankie, was very, very sound. You need to know the territory you're in and then reach out to the local communities there who have knowledge keepers who perhaps have some experience with the legal system. I kind of moved down the questions a little bit, and there was a question about the importance of having Indigenous law courses mandatory, and so I completed my answer to the first question. I'm just going to move on to that because I really wanted to speak to that. It is critical and it should be mandatory and not optional. And the reason for that is we know that there's a huge overrepresentation of our people within the legal system. So if you don't understand culturally how we operate, what laws in a traditional sense are applicable to our way of knowing and understanding, then we're always going to be at the short end of the stick going through the legal system. So there needs to be strong cultural sensitivity, awareness, and implementation. in the learning process and in the actual action process within the system itself. So I just wanted to offer that right away because I feel very strongly about that. I know lots of questions are rolling in here, but I wanted to say that. I'm hearing that you can't hear me well. I apologize. Let me try and fix it. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so I don't know what's going on with my computer. I'm so sorry. I feel like it's misbehaving. Maybe it needs some cultural sensitivity as well. But I totally support what Frankie was saying. This is really, really important. Knowing the territory you are in and understanding the teachings or the laws or the cultural worldview and values that would be present within that area is vital. And you can just simply look up the territory you're in, reach out to the local community and see if there's somebody who is familiar with the law system and with some of our traditional teachings, and ask for advice, ask for guidance, ask for support, and learn how to do that with protocol practices in place. So I was given tobacco to speak here today, and that's an Anishinaabe protocol. It's the way that it's the actual contract. I mean, yeah, there'll be a payment financially, which is normal. Honorariums are normal, but the protocol for me, when you're asking my advice, is to provide me with tobacco. And the other thing that I wanted to speak about was there's a question about uh, Indigenous courses being optional in the training portion of your preparation to be within the legal system. I think this is a vitally important. We are overrepresented in the legal system, and you're going to run across us again and again and again. You don't know what we look like, you don't know what we sound like, but for sure we're going to come through knowing who we are, and perhaps carrying some misunderstanding about the legal system and some expectations that the legal system will respect our cultural values, knowings, understandings, and expectations in lots of different ways. So I think that instead of those courses being optional, they should be mandatory, because you're going to deal with us again and again and again. Speaking from kind of an Ontario perspective, because that's where I'm located here in Canada, I know in the northern jails, 80% of the prison population is our people. So this, if that's not overrepresentation, then I don't know what is. And did they have a chance to have some sort of cultural sensitivity or empathy shown in maybe some diversion or some other options where a broader picture could be taken into consideration when it comes to dealing with our people, men, women, and youth? That's what I have to say.
Meg Rich, I would just like to add, I uphold both what Frankie and Kim are saying, and very, very important. These resources are available. It's really important to have relationship with First Nations people through vetted elders, for they are the knowledge holders of these traditional ways. Another thing I would like to add, it's really important as practicing lawyers that in that interview with clients, that you allow them to speak about who they are, who their people are, where they are from, and what they understand in terms of their culture and their terms of understanding of traditional laws. And that you take that time, that human to human contact, to really listen and hear. And the introduction of the Gladue is also a very vital piece, that you understand thoroughly the part that the Gladue diversion play. So that's pretty much all I wanted to add. Thank you.
One more thing, just out of interest for you, if you wanted, to experience why cultural understanding is important, look up bear walking. It took place in northern Ontario, and it's a case, two cases that are on the books that were unresolved, and they're distinctly culturally related. So if you had an understanding, you'd be able to navigate this case and have a broader appreciation for how significant it is. Um, within our cultural norms and practices. So I just wanted to throw that in to make it interesting.
Just to add to that, your stimulating me to have deeper thoughts here, Kim. Thank you. The notion of restorative justice, those traditional talking circles as a remedy to law, I
Yes.
for Indigenous peoples is vital. And your knowledge of that, your knowledge of the notion that Frankie introduced of two-eyed seeing, this alone, carrying this knowledge is medicine. It will help alter the justice system going forward.
Can I just add one thing here? Well, actually, I also want to answer someone's question. So Sarah Lawson is this, somebody's asking where they can read that article, because I think it's going to be an amazing article. It may, I don't think it's out just yet. And it's Sarah Lawson. She's a student at Western Law, and it's at Head Notes at Windsor Law School. So Head Notes is they'll be publishing papers and blogs, I think. I also wanted to add, this is another reason that this is so critical. There were so many insights given to myself and my co-instructor during the Indigenous law course. One student let me know that after she learned, so there was so many negative impacts of the Indian Act in terms of, well, it's too long to get into. But what's so interesting is that this student was so horrified by the things that she learned about the Indian Act, because we did an exercise with them, 21 things that you didn't know about the Indian Act. She went home to talk to her parents and say, and to find out what their understanding is. They had never heard of the Indian Act. They didn't know what the Indian Act was. And so this is so important. So this really opened her eyes, and she thought, and they had heard something about Indian residential schools, but they had not really, they didn't have the full context, so they didn't understand the Indian Act, never heard of it, not even understand it. So this, so one of the comments that this student made is it's critical for people like her and other lawyers coming up and being trained to have these kinds of courses, and how important it is, because she went through all of her undergrad degree and is now in her second year of law and is learning about things like the Indian Act, learning about Indigenous legal traditions. So this should not be in the year 2021 in Canada. So I just wanted to add that about the lack of knowledge and awareness that's out.
Thank you. I know that there were a lot of really great questions. I'm going to say that we can't get to everything today, but Kim, Constance, Frankie, I'm sure that these wonderful people would be willing to engage in a conversation afterwards. If anyone has any questions, I myself have asked questions to each one of Frankie, Constance, Kim. So please hold on to those questions. And if you feel that you have time afterwards, or maybe it's after this event, please feel free to reach out to either myself or one of the speakers, and we'll try and make sure that we can get to those questions. I wish we had all day, but we're going to try and get through as much as we can. I want to introduce our next speaker today. She is actually going to engage in a workshop, so we're going to have some time to discuss everything that we're learning here today, which is a lot. And we're going to have some time to break out into rooms and have a bit of time to chat with each other. So Samantha Matters is here. She is the founding director of Future Ancestors Services. She's an accomplished academic, published Indigenous researcher, foresight strategist, and a proud member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. She is the co-founder of The Poison and the Apple, a nonprofit organization that highlights youth-led social environmental projects. In her foresight work, Samantha explores possible futures through the lens of Indigenous futurism, ancestry, and equity. Thank you for being here, Samantha. I'll let you get started on your presentation.
Thank you so much. I often feel very strange listening to my own biography be read, but thank you for that lovely introduction. So yes, my name is Samantha Matters. I am one of the directors at Future Ancestor Services. And before I begin my presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to pause and thank all of the wonderful speakers who came before me. So our knowledge keeper, Kim, thank you so much for that beautiful song and your words to start us off in a good way, and to Constance for your prayer and those medicines teachings. And I also want to thank you, Frankie. I've learned so much from you already in just this short time. So I just wanted to offer my gratitude to all of you. As someone who carries Métis identity, who's actively reconnecting with those kin and that culture, I feel so grateful to be in the presence of such brilliant Indigenous women today. So merci to all of you. I'm going to share some slides that I put together for us today, because as was mentioned, we're going to do a little bit more of a kind of workshop session now. So I don't have a background in law or the legal system, but I do have a background in research, and specifically looking at decolonizing research. So I wanted to share some perspectives on this term decolonization in the context of the Canadian legal system with y'all today. So as was mentioned a few times previously today, I also wanted to take a moment just to pause and allow us all to reflect on something that we'd like to call ancestral accountability at Future Ancestors. And I really like to share this quote from Stella Caban in these kind of virtual meeting spaces, because I think this is an interesting way for us to reflect on our ancestry, but also reflect on the history of the land on which we find ourselves. So this quote I'm just offering to prompt us all to think a little bit more about where we come from and who our ancestors are and how we are accountable to their legacy. But also how we ourselves can be considered future ancestors. How are we accountable to our descendants, to those that we will leave behind? And this is something that I think a lot about in my work as somebody who is reconnecting to Métis ancestry, and what that means for my own journey in terms of learning about my ancestors, about my peoples, and how I kind of bring that forward in the work that I do. So if you have a minute today, I would definitely encourage you to do that. So I'm going to introduce myself in my language, Michif, which I'm also working on reclaiming. So Tanshe, bon matin, Samantha Matters, Dishinakashon. Hello, good morning. My name is Samantha Matters. I'm saying good morning because I'm calling in from Edmonton today. So it is still morning time here. And as was mentioned, I am a researcher. I am a quote unquote futurist. So that means I spend a lot of time thinking about the future, thinking about Indigenous futures specifically. And I also hold a Master of Design in Strategic Foresight. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about me because I would love to introduce you to my wonderful team at Future Ancestor Services. So we are an Indigenous and Black owned youth-led professional services social enterprise. And all of the work that we do seeks to advance climate justice and equity through that lens of ancestral accountability. So we do this through our speaking, research, training, and community services. And although we are youth-led, we also work with an intergenerational team of experts from varying disciplines. So we really try to foster that spaces of intergenerational learning where we can all learn from one another. So these are my lovely co-directors. We also have our founder and managing director, Larissa Crawford. So if you want to check us out, you can follow us on all social medias, and we're also, our website is futureancestors.ca. So just to open up our session together, I wanted to pose a question for you all and encourage you to share your responses in our chat feature. So just quickly reflecting, I would like you to share one word that comes to mind when you think about decolonization. So just the first word that comes into your mind, if you feel comfortable, just pop that into the chat. And while you're reflecting on that, I wanted to share a bit of a personal story to kind of set the stage and the context for how I'm coming into this space today. And this is a story about a recent interaction that I had with a young law student. And this interaction honestly left me feeling pretty hesitant to engage in this space today. So I was working with somebody who was studying law and who was actually in a program specifically focused on Indigenous legal orders. And what came out of this interaction, of this relationship, were some pretty anti-Indigenous sentiments, which left me feeling very concerned about just the legal system in general and how young lawyers are being educated today. So essentially, after I was working with this individual for some time, we were planning an event together that focused on creating space for Indigenous leaders in our community in Edmonton to, occupy a virtual space where they could offer teachings about both food and gender from a decolonial lens. So this event sounded really amazing. We were kind of making space for these Indigenous knowledge keepers to share these teachings with other youth in Edmonton. And after raising some concerns that, this individual I was working with had offered specialized access to our event for law students who aren't even from Edmonton, this individual kind of took that as, a personal kind of direct attack on them. And their response was to me, an Indigenous person, that, I'm studying in this law program. This is about Indigenous people. I have all of this knowledge, so I'm going to come in and tell you that this is a space for non-Indigenous people, that I need to invite them. They need to learn. I need to elevate this event for these law students, which was not really the purpose of our event. So this ended up spiraling quite a lot and left me feeling, that I think we all have so much to learn from one another. So I just wanted to kind of make some space here today for us to do that. And I think our previous speakers have done such a lovely job in kind of setting that tone. So I really want to encourage us all to reflect on the way that we engage with one another, and also some of the conceptions that we hold about this term decolonization. So with that, I'm going to get into the content of my talk today. And we're going to be looking at these three different terms. So we have decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation. So these are terms you may have heard quite often, and I find that they are commonly used almost interchangeably. And while we can understand these terms as being connected and related to one another, we also really have to get clear on our language and understand how these are different concepts on their own. So I'm going to go into a bit of a look today at what each of these terms mean and how we can kind of understand them as separate yet connected. So we're going to start off with decolonization. So when we're thinking about this term, we're referring to the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. So we've been talking about this a bit already today, and understanding, if we're talking about decolonization, we have to first deeply understand colonization itself. And specifically, I think today, we have to understand how the legal system in what we currently know as Canada is a tool of the colonial project. So we can think of decolonization as the removal or undoing of colonial elements. But it's really important that we look at the context that we exist in. So within the settler colonial state of Canada. So it's really important to understand those two elements first. So, what is colonization at its root? And then also how can we understand that within the context we find ourselves? The second term is indigenization. So separate from decolonization, indigenization is this process of naturalizing Indigenous knowledge and systems and making them evident to transform spaces, places, and even ourselves. So if we're thinking about decolonization as the undoing of colonial elements, we can then think of indigenization as the addition or redoing of Indigenous elements. So one important note about indigenization is that this term is asking us to move beyond those kind of tokenistic gestures of recognition or of inclusion, and to look at how we can meaningfully change our practices and structures. So we're looking at change here at a fundamental level. And then finally, we have reconciliation. So this term is speaking to addressing past wrongs, making amends, and really importantly, improving relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we're doing this in order to create a better future for everyone. So a really key element of reconciliation is that this is something that is ultimately a settler responsibility. So that's a really critical piece. How do we address those past wrongs? How do we make amends? How do we repair those relationships? And I think this quote from Murray Sinclair, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chair, really beautifully captures an understanding of reconciliation. So we have reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, an atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So I think those are all really critical elements that we need to think about when we're talking about reconciliation, because the TRC is really challenging us to do just that, to build our awareness, to acknowledge harm that has been caused, to atone for those harms, and then also to look at action to change behavior for the future. So as we mentioned, it's really important that we understand how all of these terms exist and stand on their own, but we can also look at how they can become interconnected. So this is from a resource by Deborah McGregor. And at the end of my talk, I have the citations and some links I'll share with you also to be able to access some of the work that I've used to frame this conversation. So if we look at the interconnection points, we can look at decolonization as a component of indigenization, because we're starting to challenge that dominance of Western thought, and we're looking at bringing Indigenous thought to the forefront. We can also look at indigenization as a piece of reconciliation, because remember, this involves creating new relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But we also have to remember, that distinction between indigenization and reconciliation, and that falls again with this understanding that reconciliation is a settler responsibility, while decolonization must be led by Indigenous peoples. So I wanted to make that distinction really clearly for us there. And I think another thing that's really helpful when we're talking about decolonization is to look at, what decolonization is not. To help us really, wrap our minds around this concept, we have to remember that decolonization requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. So when we are talking about colonization and settler sovereignty, we have to look at how those those structures, those systems impose themselves on almost every aspect of our lives. So from sexuality, our legal systems, raciality, language, religion, how we understand property and ownership, all of these are imposed upon by systems of colonization. So any approach that we're taking towards decolonization, we have to take a holistic look. We have to consider all of these elements. And I specifically want to speak to this piece about ownership. So in Canada, our quote unquote ownership of land is structured around this denial of Indigenous jurisdiction. And we heard a bit about this from Frankie and how, the Indian Act has been applied to deny Indigenous jurisdiction. And we also have these, the creation and enforcement of legal fictions. So when I'm talking about these legal fictions, I'm speaking to this idea of the physical removal and relocation of Indigenous peoples from the land. And then further beyond that, we also have the criminalization of accessing that land. So we're very blatantly denying Indigenous rights and jurisdiction over these lands. We also have social institutions like residential schools and the child welfare system that continue to remove Indigenous people from the land. And then again, political and legislative strategies like the Indian Act, like Indian registration rules. So we have all of these fictions that are being applied to Indigenous peoples at different levels that are really preventing Indigenous jurisdiction from being kind of honored and upheld. So one example of this that I wanted to share with you actually comes from the Yellowhead Institute's Land Back Red Paper. So this is a really critical piece of work that I would recommend everyone taking a look at. Again, I'll share the citation and link at the end. But one thing that this paper brings forward is this observable increase in the number of injunctions that have been filed over the last 20 years. So we could, look at this increase due to our legal system adjusting to Aboriginal constitutional rights that were introduced in 1982. So we have this rise of Aboriginal rights and law that are now kind of forcing or encouraging companies and governments to look at new legal tools to push past Indigenous assertions of jurisdiction over land and water. So if we look deeper into this correlation, we can see that, almost all injunctions that are triggered are related to resources or development. And what's more here, I think, is that 81% of injunctions filed against First Nations by corporations were granted, but 81% of injunctions filed against corporations by First Nations were denied. So we have this same legal tool, but the way that it's being applied, we can see is drastically different. And the other thing is that most of these injunctions are those interim or temporary injunctions. And this is largely because this pathway, this legal tool is the quickest, the fastest way to involve police and law enforcement, which is, another topic we could talk about in itself when it comes to law enforcement and Indigenous peoples in what we currently call Canada. So, we've seen how this plays out. So, for example, Wet'suwet'en injunction at the end of 2019 and previous before that. So we can see how while we have Indigenous rights and law being brought to the forefront on one side with the introduction of Aboriginal constitutional rights, we're also seeing that the legal system has different mechanisms for denying those rights as well. So I wanted to share this quote. This is from another really foundational resource by Eve Tuck and Wang Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I wanted to offer this one for a moment of personal reflection. So until stolen land is returned, critical consciousness does not translate into action that disrupts settler colonialism. And I would just encourage you to sit with that quote and reflect on your reaction to it. Reflect on how that feels in your body. Reflect on what kind of emotions that brings up. Because I think this is something that, we're not really accustomed to doing when we talk about decolonization. We're not accustomed to feeling those kind of uncomfortable truths of, until stolen land is returned. I just want you to sit with that for a moment. And I think that, it's really important to do this reflective work, this self-reflective work, because often what we see is kind of the absorption of decolonization by settler social justice frameworks for their own purpose. So when we do this, when we absorb that term or that understanding of decolonization for our own purposes, we are recentering whiteness. We are removing settler responsibility, we're removing settler accountability, and ultimately, we're seeking to entertain a settler future. So decolonization is not the conversion of Indigenous politics into a Western doctrine of liberation, okay? This is not a process of quote unquote helping at risk and alleviating suffering. This is not a generic term for the struggle against all oppressive conditions and outcomes. And this is not just another way of talking about social justice. So remember, for us to understand decolonization, we first have to understand colonization at its root here on what we currently know as Canada. And we have to remember that the ultimate goal of the colonizer was, and still remains, the replacement of self-determining Indigenous nations with a population of individuals who either assimilate or die away. And this is something that really kind of hits home for me because I didn't grow up with connection to my Indigenous kin. And that is largely because of intergenerational trauma caused by colonial impacts on our family. So decolonization demands that we acknowledge these kind of truths. And just as settler colonialism is unsettling, decolonization is and should be unsettling as well. So again, that's why I say it's so important to do that self-reflective work. So if we're using this term decolonization in our justice work, we really have to kind of ask ourselves, is this work a diversion or a distraction to relieve those kind of feelings that are coming up? Or is this work attempting to conceal the need to give up land, power, or privilege? Is this work accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and an Indigenous future? And I think that's the piece that kind of links me back to that story I shared at the beginning. Are we doing this work in a way that's accountable to an Indigenous future? Or is this another way of, doing that kind of self-serving work that we see happen so often in social justice movements? So I'm going to skip forward just a little bit, recognizing time, but I wanted to offer some ways of engaging with decolonization as individuals who hold settler identity. And I think a really critical element is first, again, examining your beliefs about Indigenous peoples and culture. So what are those kind of underlying assumptions that we might be holding? The second piece is learning about yourself in relationship to the communities where you live and the people with whom you interact. So again, doing that self-reflective work of our own ancestry and our ancestors' relationships with the original peoples of this land. And then finally, understanding your role in upholding systems of colonization. And I think this one is super critical for our content here today around the legal system. Because, up until, for example, 1993 in British Columbia, we still had sexual sterilization acts that were applied heavily to Indigenous peoples. So this is an act that was, still recognized, still in place up to a year after I myself was born. And what we see with this kind of legislation is that, while race is not specifically mentioned in either of these acts, so the British Columbia one or the Alberta one from 1928 to 1972, these acts are grounded in principles of eugenics. So weeding out those quote unquote unfavorable conditions that we don't want to see in our population, which is, directly rooted in these racist ideologies that we have in Canada. So even though, it's not written into the act, what we see is Indigenous women who are sterilized at a far greater rate because of the institutionalization of the social construct of race within our legal system. So while we can look at these things historically, it's really important to understand that they bleed into the present day. And that, forced sterilization continues to happen today. And we recently saw a lawsuit come up in Saskatchewan, I believe, that was addressing just this fact. And so finally, before we get into our breakout rooms, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on allyship and solidarity. So to be fully honest, when I hear the term, allyship, being an ally, I get a little bit of kind of tightness in my chest. I don't love that term because I think what we find a lot is in allyship, we're looking at, helping or standing up for somebody who is disadvantaged. We're looking at performative acts of solidarity work. Or, I think a really good example is this past summer when we had, a wash of the Black Instagram tiles in support of Black Lives Matter on, feeds that have never spoken about social justice issues before. So allyship for me is a little bit performative. I want us to think about solidarity. So when we are speaking about solidarity, we are acknowledging this destruction caused by white supremacy to all of humanity. When we're talking about solidarity, we're looking at work to dismantle colonial structures and institutions. So to help us shift our understanding of allyship towards solidarity, I kind of have four different, approaches, four different steps we might take. So again, the first one is self-reflection, always reflecting on the privilege, power, and worldview that we bring into our work and how that influences our position within society, how that influences our ability to influence others, to influence systems. The second one is know history. So learning the Indigenous history of Canada is so critically important. As Frankie mentioned earlier, we have law students entering their second year, not knowing the history of the Indian Act or residential schools. So acknowledging some of those uncomfortable truths and understanding that Indigenous and settler stories here on what we call Canada are inextricably linked. And we have to recognize that. The third one is build relationships. So building authentic and meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. This is the foundation for all of the work that we need to do together. It has to be centered around relationship, how we understand one another, how we work together. And then finally, the last one is make space. So we have to respect Indigenous spaces and Indigenous movements. And we have to recognize when our role is to make that space rather than take up that space. Sometimes our work as individuals who hold settler identities is to step back to make that room. And I think that's a really critical acknowledgement that we all have to make. So with that, we are going to move into, I think, some breakout rooms if we still have time. And I have a few questions for us. Shalane, do we have time for breakout rooms?
Yes, we're going to do a 3-minute breakout room. It's going to be really quick, but I just want to give people a couple minutes to just chat amongst themselves. So
Awesome. So I have these questions here for you if you would like a prompt, but I think that so much incredible knowledge has been shared with us today that I would encourage you just to reflect on everything that you've heard and maybe offer, one thing that stood out, one thing that you learned, offer how you're feeling in this space right now. But if you would like some prompts, I have some here for you as well. So we can head off into our breakout rooms.
Okay, that's going to happen in a minute.
I just want to say thank you, Samantha, for your inspired words and how thorough you and your team have been with these teachings. I've certainly learned a lot from listening to you, and for a young Métis woman who is trying to become reconnected, reunited with those familial lines, your understanding and your wisdom is deep and abiding. So from my heart to yours, Chimigwich.
Hello?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I just want to, we're at the end of our session now. I wanted to give some time to Constance and Kim to close the session. Whoever has to leave now, you may go ahead and leave, but if you want to stay for the closing, please do so. Kim and Constance, are you here?
Here.
Oh,
Here
great.
am I.
Okay. So Kim, why don't you go ahead, and then Constance, you can follow, and we'll close the session.
So bonjour again, Kinawea. Greetings, my relatives. I'm so proud of you. So very proud of each and every one of you for logging in today, for staying the course, for participating, for thinking, for being prodded, for carrying seeds to contemplate on post this engagement, for offering I guess a space and place where we can feel like, as authentic Indigenous voice, trying to talk from our hearts to your hearts, we've been held and supported in that safe space. I want you to know that I believe each and every one of you to be a superhero. You are the change makers that we are depending on, no matter what lens you're coming through from. The amazing presentation by Samantha to help guide us through how to go through this process and how to look at the words. Words are power, and in the legal system, those words have definitely affected us in deep and life-changing ways. And so understanding with a lot of sensitivity, not just a little bit of sensitivity, and choosing to embrace that and activate that is my greatest hope. I feel so privileged to have sat through this presentation from both Frankie, Samantha, and of course the beautiful questions that were offered. And I just really wanted to offer in a very condensed short way, because I do feel a bit pressured that some of you do have to leave, but I want you to know how deeply my ancestors are looking at this and thanking you through my voice today, and how beautiful the messaging from Constance, that great couching of prayerful love and foundational connections is important. I look forward to what you will do, what you will manifest, what you will kind of lead into forcing and encouraging enforcement of those changes, and embracing our way of knowing on the lands that have always been ours, that will continue to be ours, the ones that we hold in the greatest of respect, esteem, understanding, and relationship. We will never sever our ties to our home. We will continue to welcome all those who want to come and call this place home, and we will always embrace you with the greatest of respect, care, and love. So I hope that I have supported you in a meaningful way, and that you have felt safe in this dialogue. Never be shy to learn. We are here to support you and encourage you. Miigwech to level for including me. I have certainly enjoyed this opportunity and the beautiful, graceful, welcoming way that this was delivered and shared. Even if you knew nothing, which I didn't know a whole lot, I feel like I'm leaving richer for the experience, and I hope each and every one of you is sincerely leaving better than when you came. That is my greatest prayer for you on this day. Nahau miigwech.
Thank you, Constance.
So I have learned, and I feel so edified by the things that were spoken of here today. I hope you all did too. I hope these thoughts expressed inspire you to go forward and continue a dialogue. And that in that dialogue, I always say to the students at the Faculty of Law, we all come together with diverse cultural ancestry, and in our diversity, in all our cultures, we all have a knowledge and an understanding of what it means to escape and of colonization, and for the settler people who came here to have a new life, a better way of living. You carry with you that ancestral knowledge of what it means to be oppressed. And therefore, your knowledge, your ancestral knowledge that you carry into the conversation influences the outcome for the justice system for the future. And together, when we sit in these conversations, our relationship grows as we can vision a future in a justice system for all peoples. And, I turn now. Oh, I want to say thank you, Shalane and Caitlin. You've taken such good care of me throughout our relationship, and it's always a pleasure to sit with you. And I'm going to turn to the medicines.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim, Constance, Samantha, Caitlin, Frankie. This was wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Nice to see you all.